Welcome to another deep dive. This one's particularly interesting because we asked you what you wanted to hear about, and a bunch of you sent in a fascinating collection of lectures, and they all really kind of revolve around this intersection of neuroscience and spirituality.
Oh, wow.
And so we've got these lectures that touch on everything from neurotransmitters to mystical experiences to the impact of religious practices on the brain.
Mm.
And we thought, okay, well, let's just take a deep dive into these and see what we can uncover.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that I think is interesting, right out of the gate, they start talking about this idea of is there a spirit molecule?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they spend some time in the beginning talking about DMT,
Right.
which is this naturally occurring neurotransmitter.
Hmm.
And in large amounts, it can induce these really intense hallucinations and euphoria, and some people even have mystical experiences on it. So it's really interesting to kind of think about, like, is there really a single chemical that can sort of unlock spirituality?
Right. It's so tempting to try to find like a simple answer, right?
Yeah.
Like one thing. But I think when you consider the vastness of spiritual experiences that people report and the different types, it seems unlikely that it would just boil down to like one single molecule.
Right, right. And they do go on to say it's more like an orchestra
Uh-huh.
of neurotransmitters, that play a part. So, for instance, we know that serotonin is often associated with, feelings of well-being and
Oh,
peace.
yeah.
And, it seems like levels of serotonin often increase during things like prayer and meditation.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then you have, dopamine, which is all about reward and motivation. And so that could also be contributing to the feelings of joy and bliss that people associate with spiritual experiences.
Right. Okay. So it's not just this DMT thing. It's more like a whole cocktail
Right.
of chemicals going on.
Yeah.
What about people who are intentionally trying to induce these types of experiences, whether through psychedelics or things like even electrical stimulation?
Right, right. That's a whole other layer to this.
Yeah.
Because, it brings up these really interesting questions about, well, what do we define as a real spiritual experience? Like, is something that you experience during meditation more real than something that's triggered by, a psychedelic drug, or is it more about the subjective experience that the person is having?
Hmm. Right. Right. That really makes you think. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting that they brought up was this study that Baylor University did, where they identified four main types of God that Americans tend to perceive.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And these are authoritarian, critical, distant, and benevolent. And so, I mean, does this mean that our brains are literally creating these different versions of God?
Well, in a way, yes. The lectures they really highlight how our cognitive functions play a role in how we conceptualize God, especially our holistic thinking and reductionist thinking. But what I found fascinating is that even something as abstract as God, people often tend to visualize it in a very human-like form.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, our brains are kind of wired to recognize faces.
Exactly. Yeah, and we tend to kind of project that onto the unknown, and you can even see that reinforced in some research on conversational prayer, where brain scans have shown similar patterns of activity, whether someone is talking to God or talking to another person.
Wow.
It's almost like our brains are treating God as a real social being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So we've established that our brains shape how we see God.
Yeah.
But these lectures, they go a step further and they ask, can God and religion shape our brains in return?
Ooh, okay. Now we're getting somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they talk about studies that have been done on Carmelite nuns who have these mystical experiences and people who've had near-death experiences. And they have shown some really intriguing changes in brain activity, particularly in areas that are associated with emotion and self-awareness. So basically engaging with these spiritual ideas and practices can actually leave a physical imprint on our brains.
It seems that way. Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But I guess it's important to point out that it's not always a straightforward positive impact.
Right.
They do point out that certain religious beliefs can sometimes contribute to negative emotions like guilt and fear.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's definitely not one size fits all.
Right. So we've covered neurotransmitters, these stimulated states, and the brain shaping our concept of God.
Yeah.
But I think underlying all of this really big question is, how does our brain even determine what is real?
Oh, that's a big one.
That's the ultimate question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they talk about these different knowing states, the frameworks that our brains are using to try to make sense of the world. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that, um, they talk about an experiment where believers and non-believers were shown distorted images, and they were asked to identify what they saw. And both groups had, flawed perceptions, which really, I think, highlights how much, our beliefs can influence what we perceive to be real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What we see isn't always an objective representation of reality. Our minds are filtering everything through our own individual experiences and beliefs. And I love this quote that they bring up from the Sufi mystic Ibn al-Arabi. He said, "God deposited within man knowledge of all things, and then prevented him from perceiving what he had deposited within him."
That's a lot to think about. So we've explored how neurotransmitters play a role,
Mhm.
how our brains shape our understanding of God, and then how our beliefs, can reshape our brains. But I
Yeah.
think that there's one more thought-provoking question that we want to leave you with,
Okay.
and that is, if God is at least in part a creation of our brains,
Mm.
then why does this idea of God persist so stubbornly across cultures and throughout history?
Right, right. If it's all in our heads, then why is it still here?
Yeah. Why is it so sticky? Why is it so prevalent?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, we'll have to dive into that in our next part. Yeah. So why does this idea of God stick around?
Yeah.
The lectures touch on some possible explanations, and I'm curious to get your take on those.
Hmm.
One that stood out to me was the power of social influence. How that shapes our beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about we're social creatures by nature, right? Right.
Yes.
And the lectures actually mention some studies where people were more likely to agree with a clearly wrong answer just because everyone else in the group did.
Oh wow. Like peer pressure, basically.
Yeah, it's like, we have this deep-seated need to belong, to fit in. And sometimes that means kind of ignoring what we know to be true or going along with the crowd, even if we have our doubts.
Right, right. It's like that experiment where, they have people judging the length of lines.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And even when they can see that one is clearly longer, if everyone else is saying that they're the same, they start to doubt themselves.
Exactly. And when you think about it, so many of our beliefs, especially religious ones, are passed down, from our families, our communities. We're raised in these environments where a certain set of belief is just kind of, accepted as truth.
Right. And then you layer on top of that all the rituals and practices that sort of reinforce those beliefs.
Exactly. Yeah. The repetition.
Yeah.
Think about things like prayer or chanting or singing hymns, attending services week after week. These are all these repetitive actions, and the lectures talk about how that repetition, it actually strengthens the neural connections in our brains, making those beliefs just feel more real, more ingrained.
It's like, carving a path through the woods.
Mm-hmm.
The more you walk that same route, the more defined it becomes.
Exactly. Yeah. And on the flip side, the lectures also talk about how our brains can sometimes fill in the gaps.
Right. They talk about pattern seeking. How our brains love to see patterns and make connections, even where they might not actually exist.
Right. It's like our brains are kind of wired to find meaning, even in randomness.
Yeah. Yeah. We're meaning-making machines.
Yeah.
Right. And historically, we attributed a lot of, unexplained phenomena to the actions of gods.
Right.
Storms, earthquakes, disease.
It was a way to make sense of the world.
Right.
When it felt, chaotic and unpredictable.
So as we've gained more scientific understanding, I mean, has the need for God diminished?
Well, even with all of our scientific advancements, we still have those fundamental questions.
Right.
Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? What happens after we die?
Yeah. The big existential questions.
Mhm. Yeah, and for many people, the idea of God still provides this sense of comfort, this sense of purpose, in the face of those big unknowns.
It seems like the idea of God really taps into something deep within us. this longing for connection, for meaning, for something that transcends just the purely material world.
Absolutely. And from a neurological perspective, that feeling of comfort, that feeling of security that people associate with belief, that might actually be activating the reward pathways in our brains.
Mm,
So it's not just a social or cultural phenomenon. There might actually be a biological basis for why this idea of God is so enduring.
right, right. That's really fascinating. In the lectures, um, they brought up this concept of self-transcendence.
Uh-huh.
Those experiences where we feel this sense of connection to something larger than ourselves.
Yeah, those moments where the boundaries of the self just seem to kind of dissolve, and we feel this oneness or unity with something greater. And the lectures actually suggest that these experiences might be linked to specific changes in brain activity.
Yeah, they talk about the parietal lobe, the part of the brain that helps create our sense of self,
Yeah.
and how activity in that area actually decreases during these self-transcended experiences.
Yeah, it's almost like by quieting that part of the brain, the part that's so focused on me, on the self, we can temporarily loosen the grip of the ego and experience a more expansive sense of connection.
Right, right, like a letting go almost.
Yeah, yeah.
So these experiences of self-transcendence, um, they might be providing us with a glimpse into something beyond our ordinary ego-bound awareness.
It's possible. And the concept of God then offers a way to understand those glimpses, to integrate them into our worldview.
Right, because it gives us a framework.
A language, yeah. For
Yeah.
making sense of it all.
Okay. Okay. So now we're getting to the point where it's like, okay, well, is the brain hardwired for spirituality?
Right, right. Like, are we biologically predisposed to seek out these experiences of connection, of transcendence?
Mm, that's a big question.
Yeah, and the lectures, they don't shy away from that question.
Okay.
They talk about these primary knowing states,
Uh-huh.
these fundamental ways that our brains perceive and interpret reality. And they emphasize that these knowing states aren't fixed. They can shift and evolve, based on our experiences and even, the physical state of our brains. And they talk about, three key processes: perceptual, causal, and emotional, that contribute to how we construct our own individual realities.
So it's not just about what we're perceiving with our senses. It's also how we're interpreting those perceptions
Mm.
based on,
Yeah.
our understanding of cause and effect,
Wait. Yeah.
and our emotional responses.
Yeah. And they actually give this really great example of imagine someone walking through a forest.
Okay.
Right, so they're taking in all the sights and sounds,
Yeah.
the sunlight filtering through the leaves, the scent of pine needles. But their experience of that forest, it's not just limited to those sensory perceptions.
Right. Their brain's going to start making connections,
Yeah.
interpreting patterns.
Yeah, they might notice, the symbiotic relationship between the trees and the fungi,
Yeah.
or the way that sunlight is nourishing the ecosystem, the cycle of life and death that's playing out all around them.
Yeah.
And then, their emotional response to that adds another layer. They might feel this sense of awe and wonder at the beauty and complexity of the forest, or a sense of peace and tranquility being surrounded by nature.
So their reality of the forest isn't just a collection of these objective facts.
Right.
It's this complex interplay of perception, interpretation, and emotion.
Exactly. Yeah.
And bringing this back to the idea of God, our brains are constantly constructing reality, based on these processes. Then it makes sense that our understanding of God is also, being shaped by these forces.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, someone whose primary knowing state is characterized by, this sense of interconnectedness, this strong belief in a benevolent higher power, and those feelings of awe and reverence. They might experience God as a very real and present force in their lives.
Right.
Whereas someone whose knowing state is more rooted in a materialistic worldview, a skepticism toward the supernatural, and a focus on logic and reason, they might find the idea of God less convincing.
Right.
And it's not about one being right and one being wrong. It's about recognizing that, our brains are creating these different versions of reality based on, our individual wiring and our experiences and our
Yeah.
beliefs.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And this leads to what I thought was one of the most profound takeaways from these lectures, and that is this concept of an integrated approach
Right.
to understanding the world.
Yeah. So what do they mean by integrated?
Yeah. I'm curious. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do they mean by integrate? I'm curious. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, it's this idea that we don't have to choose between science and spirituality. We can view them as complementary ways of understanding the world, each offering its own unique insights.
So it's not about like picking sides. It's about seeing how these different perspectives can actually enrich each other.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, science gives us, the tools to explore the physical mechanisms of the brain. How neurochemicals and neural pathways, create our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences. But spirituality delves into, the deeper meaning and purpose behind those experiences. It prompts us to ask those big existential questions like, who are we? And why are we here?
Yeah, it's like science helps us understand the how,
Yeah.
and spirituality is exploring the why.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and by embracing both perspectives, we can gain, a much more complete and nuanced understanding of ourselves and the universe that we inhabit.
So rather than seeing them as these opposing forces, we can view science and spirituality as different lenses through which we can examine the same reality.
Yeah, I like that. Different lenses.
Each lens reveals different aspects, different layers of understanding.
Exactly. And by holding both of those lenses up, we can see a more multifaceted, more complex, and ultimately, I think, a more beautiful picture.
Yeah, I love that. It's a call for both intellectual rigor, but also an openness to the mysteries that science may not yet fully grasp.
Absolutely. Yeah. And remember, our understanding of the brain, of consciousness, of spirituality, it's all constantly evolving.
Right.
We're just at the beginning of this incredible journey of discovery.
That's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah.
There's always more to explore, more questions to ask, more mysteries to unravel.
It's about staying curious,
Yeah,
keeping that sense of wonder alive.
you got it. Well, I think it's safe to say that this deep dive has given us plenty to ponder. Thank you so much for sharing these lectures with us. They've been incredibly thought-provoking.
Yeah, my pleasure. And to you, the listener, thank you for joining us on this exploration into the fascinating realm where neuroscience and spirituality intersect. Keep those minds curious, the spirits soaring, and never stop exploring those big questions. Until next time, keep diving deep.